The house was silent when I pulled into the driveway that first morning. Not the peaceful kind of silent, the kind that sits on your chest and won't let go. And the worst part, the part I didn't understand until much later, was that the silence wasn't coming from inside the house at all. It was coming from me. My name is Dorothy, and I was 63 years old the spring I agreed to marry a man I barely knew. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not a foolish woman. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse in Austin, Texas. I have held the hands of dying strangers. I have watched doctors deliver impossible news to families who were not ready to hear it. I know what desperation looks like. I know what it smells like. And I know that when it comes for you, truly comes for you, it doesn't knock politely on the front door. It breaks the window at 3 a.m. and sits down at your kitchen table like it owns the place. My son was 38 years old when they told him his heart was failing. Not in some distant theoretical way. Failing now. The kind of failing that required a specific surgery at a specific hospital in Houston, performed by a specific surgeon who did not take the insurance plan my son had through his job at the hardware store. The number the billing office gave me over the phone was so large that I sat on the kitchen floor for a while after I hung up, not crying, just sitting, trying to understand how a number like that was real. I had savings. Not enough. I had my house. I could sell it. But the timeline didn't work. My son needed the surgery within 4 months, or the damage to his heart would become permanent. 4 months. That was the window we had. That was everything. My friend Carol is the one who told me about Richard. We had known each other since our children were in elementary school together, and she knew my situation because I had told her everything on the back porch the week after my son's diagnosis. Carol is not a dramatic person. She doesn't gossip, and she doesn't exaggerate. So when she sat across from me at my kitchen table one Thursday afternoon and said, "Dorothy, I need to tell you something strange," I listened. Richard was 71 years old. He was a widower, had been for 6 years. He owned a cattle ranch outside of Fredericksburg, about an hour and a half west of Austin, and he had built a small commercial real estate business before he retired. He was, by any reasonable measure, a wealthy man. He was also, according to his own personal attorney, who was the one who had asked Carol to ask around, quietly dying, not of heart failure like my son, of a degenerative nerve condition that had been progressing steadily for 2 years and was expected to take his life within 6 to 8 months. What Richard wanted, his attorney had explained, was a companion, a caretaker, someone to be present in the house, to help manage his daily needs as they increased, and to be, in the legal sense, his wife, because Richard had 2 adult children from his first marriage, and he did not trust either of them with the decisions that would come at the end of his life. He needed someone in his corner, someone whose interests were legally aligned with his own. In exchange, he was prepared to provide a sum of money that would cover my son's surgery, his recovery, and every medical bill attached to both, with enough remaining to give me a stable life afterward. I know how this sounds. I know exactly how it sounds. I sat with it for 4 days before I called the attorney back. I prayed about it. I talked to my son, who told me absolutely not, and then cried when he thought I had gone to the other room. I talked to Carol, who said she wouldn't judge me either way. And then I drove out to Fredericksburg on a Tuesday morning, and I sat across from Richard at a long oak table in his kitchen, and I looked at him. He was a tall man, even sitting down, white-haired, thin now in the way that illness makes people thin, but with a straightness in his posture that told you who he had been before all of this. He looked at me the same way I was looking at him. Direct, assessing, not unkind. He said, "I imagine this is an unusual situation for you." I said, "I've been a nurse for 30 years. I've seen unusual." He almost smiled. "Carol says you're practical. Carol is generous," I said. "What I am is honest. So I'll be honest with you. I'm doing this for my son. I want you to know that going in." He nodded slowly. "I'm doing this for myself," he said. "I want you to know that going in too." We were married 6 weeks later at the county courthouse. My son was there, pale and still angry with me, but there. Carol was there. Richard's attorney was there. Neither of Richard's children attended. I learned about his children, his son and his daughter, on my 3rd day at the ranch. I had known they existed, of course. The attorney had briefed me in general terms. What I had not been fully prepared for was the way they moved through that house. His son was 44, heavyset, with his father's height but none of his father's stillness. He had driven up from San Antonio the day after our wedding and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at me the way you look at something you're deciding whether to return to the store. His daughter was 41, neat and composed and cold in the particular way that well-dressed women can be cold when they have decided you are beneath them. She had flown in from Dallas. She stayed in the guest room at the end of the hall and took her meals separately for the first 2 days. Richard watched all of this with a careful neutrality that I was beginning to understand was one of his great skills. He did not escalate. He did not apologize for his children's behavior. He simply observed and waited, and I found to my own surprise that I respected him for it. By the end of the second week, I had settled into a routine. I administered Richard's medications at 7 in the morning and again at 9 at night. I prepared his meals according to the dietary guidelines his neurologist had given us. I drove him to his appointments in Fredericksburg and once a week to a specialist in San Antonio. We watched the news in the evenings. He told me about the ranch, about his late wife, about the years when the business was young and difficult and he wasn't sure it would survive. I told him about nursing, about Austin, about my son when he was small. It was not a love story. Not then. But it was something quiet and honest and, in its way, kind. The medications were what I noticed first. I noticed because I am a nurse, and nurses notice medications the way other people notice the weather. It's not a conscious decision. You simply look, and what I saw, about 3 weeks into my time at the ranch, was that the bottles on Richard's nightstand were not always the same bottles. Not different medications, the labels were the same, but the pills inside were occasionally a slightly different color, a slightly different coating, small enough that a person who wasn't looking carefully would never see it. I was looking carefully. I did not say anything. Not yet. I went back to my room and I thought about what I had seen, and I decided that before I said a single word out loud, I needed to be certain. The next morning, while Richard was in the shower, I took 2 of the pills from the bottle on his nightstand, and I put them in a small Ziploc bag I had brought from the kitchen for this exact purpose. I put the bag in the inside pocket of my purse. That afternoon, when I drove into town for groceries, I stopped at the pharmacy and had a conversation with the pharmacist, framing it carefully as a general question about pill identification, and showed him one of the pills. He told me the imprint code didn't match the medication on the label. He said it calmly, the way pharmacists speak. And then he said, "Where did you get this?" I said I needed to make a phone call before I could explain. He said he understood. He gave me his card. I sat in my car in the pharmacy parking lot, and I called Richard's personal attorney, not his estate attorney, his personal one, who had handled the original arrangement between us, and whom Richard had specifically told me to call if I ever needed anything. His name was Mr. Callahan, and he picked up on the second ring. I told him what I had found. I told him about the pills, about the pharmacist, about the mismatched color I had been tracking for several days. I told him calmly and in order, the way you present information to a doctor during a handoff, because that is the only way I know how to speak when things are serious. Mr. Callahan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dorothy, don't touch anything else in that house. Take photographs of every medication bottle in Richard's room. Do it today. Then call me back." I drove back to the ranch. His daughter's rental car was in the driveway. I went inside through the back door, set the groceries on the counter, and walked upstairs as if I were doing nothing at all unusual. In Richard's room, I photographed every bottle on the nightstand and in the medicine cabinet in his bathroom. I photographed the labels, the pill counts, the dates. I did it quickly and without a sound. Then I went back downstairs and started putting the groceries away. His daughter came into the kitchen while I was stacking cans in the pantry. She stood by the counter and watched me for a moment with that particular stillness of hers. "You were upstairs," she said. "I checked on your father's medications," I said, without turning around. "I do that every afternoon." There was a pause. "He has a doctor for that." "He has me," I said. "Which is why he married me." She left the kitchen. I stood in the pantry for a moment with my hands pressed flat against the shelf and let myself breathe. That night I called Mr. Callahan again. I told him everything I had photographed. He told me he had already been in contact with a pharmacist and a physician he trusted, and that he wanted the second pill I had taken. He asked me to keep it safe and to say nothing to anyone in the house. He also told me to start keeping a written log: dates, times, what I observed, who was present. I had already started one. The following 10 days were the longest of my life. I moved through the house carefully. I was pleasant at dinner. I answered his son's pointed questions about Richard's estate with a calm vagueness that seemed to frustrate him enormously. I watched his daughter bring Richard herbal tea each evening, a new habit that had started about a week before I arrived, according to Richard, and I noted it in my log each time. I did not intercept the tea. I waited. I documented. On a Wednesday morning, Richard had a bad episode. He was disoriented when he woke up, his hands shaking worse than usual, his words slow and mixed up in a way I had not seen before. I called his neurologist immediately and described the symptoms. The neurologist said it didn't align with what she would expect from his condition at this stage. She said she wanted him brought in that afternoon. His son was in the kitchen when I came downstairs to get my keys. He said they should wait and see, that Richard had episodes sometimes and they passed. I looked at him for a moment and then I said, "He's my husband and his doctor wants to see him today. I'm taking him today." I said it the way I used to speak to family members who were making medical decisions based on fear rather than sense. Not cruel, just clear. His son's jaw tightened. He stepped aside. At the clinic in Fredericksburg, I gave the neurologist the log I had been keeping, and I told her about the pills. I told her everything. In order. Precisely. She listened without interrupting, which is the mark of a good physician. Then she ordered blood work. Comprehensive blood work. The kind that looks for things that shouldn't be there. The results came back 2 days later. I was sitting with Richard on the back porch, watching the evening come in over the ranch, when Mr. Callahan called. I excused myself and walked to the far end of the yard, past the fence line, where no one inside the house could see me. What the blood work showed was a sustained, low-level presence of a substance that should not have been in Richard's system. The neurologist had already contacted the county sheriff's office. Mr. Callahan had already filed an emergency motion with the court regarding Richard's estate and medical decision-making authority. The net had been building, quietly and carefully, for 10 days. It was now ready to close. The sheriff came the next morning. His son was arrested in the kitchen, still in his robe. His daughter came downstairs when she heard the noise and stopped on the bottom step when she saw the deputies. She looked at me. I was standing by the window with my coffee. I did not look away. What came out over the following weeks was this. They had been medicating Richard themselves, supplementing his legitimate prescriptions with something that would accelerate his neurological decline, cloud his cognition, make him easier to manage, and less likely to change his will. They had been doing it for 3 months before I arrived. The herbal tea was part of it. They had counted on no one paying close enough attention. They had not counted on me. I want to tell you about the night Richard found out. We were in the kitchen, just the two of us, the evening after the arrests. I had made soup because it was the only thing I could think to do with my hands. Richard sat at the oak table and held his coffee cup, and I watched him absorb the information in the way that I had watched people absorb terrible news for 31 years. That slow, interior adjustment, the world rearranging itself. After a while he said, "I knew something was wrong. I thought it was the disease progressing faster than expected." "I know," I said. "You figured it out in 3 weeks." "I'm a nurse," I said. "It's what I do." He was quiet again. Then, very quietly, he said, "Thank you, Dorothy." And I don't know exactly what happened in me when he said it. Something shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies. Just a small, quiet movement. Like a door that had been slightly stuck, finally finding its frame. I sat down across from him at the table, and we finished our coffee, and we talked until past midnight about nothing in particular about the ranch, about a bird he had been watching from the back porch all week, about my son, who had had his surgery by then and was recovering well in Houston. We talked like two people who had been through something together and were still here on the other side of it. My son came to visit 6 weeks later. He was thinner than before the surgery, but the colour had come back to his face, and he walked without stopping to rest, which he hadn't been able to do in over a year. He shook Richard's hand on the front porch, and I watched the two of them, and felt something so large I didn't have a name for it. My son pulled me aside before dinner. He said, "Mum, are you okay here? For real?" I thought about the question. I thought about the oak table, and the evening light on the ranch, and the way Richard and I had learned to move around each other in the kitchen without getting in each other's way. I thought about the morning 2 weeks prior when he had reached across the truck console and put his hand briefly over mine when I was upset about something minor, a small and unremarkable gesture that had stayed with me. "I'm okay," I said. "More than okay." My son looked at me for a moment, the way children look at their parents when they're updating their understanding of who you are. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Good." The legal proceedings took several months. Both of Richard's children were charged. His son was convicted on 2 counts. His daughter accepted a plea arrangement. Neither of them will be part of Richard's life going forward, by court order and by his own choice. Richard's estate was restructured under Mr. Callahan's supervision, and Richard was clear about every decision, more clear than he had been in months, because the things that had been clouding him were finally out of his system. His neurologist told us, at an appointment in the fall, that his progression had actually been slower than the original prognosis suggested, that without the interference, he likely had considerably more time than 6 to 8 months. She said it, matter-of-factly, looking at her chart. I looked at Richard. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. On the drive home, he said, "That changes the calculation somewhat." "What calculation?" I said. He was looking out the window at the hill country rolling by. "You came here for 4 months. You may be stuck with me considerably longer." I kept my eyes on the road. "I'm aware," I said. A long pause. "Any objections?" I thought about the oak table and the coffee and the evenings on the back porch. I thought about the bird he had been watching, which had turned out to be a painted bunting, which neither of us had ever seen on the ranch before. I thought about my son, healthy and laughing at dinner the week before, telling Richard a long and ridiculous story about a customer at the hardware store, and Richard listening with that quiet attention of his, and how the room had felt. "No," I said. "No objections. I came to that ranch because my son was dying, and I was out of options, and a stranger was willing to make a transaction that would save his life. That is the whole of what I intended. I want you to know that because I think it matters not as an excuse, but as a truth. I did not come there looking for anything for myself. I was 63 years old, and I thought that chapter was finished. What I found instead was a man who looked at me directly and told me the truth from the very first conversation. A man who was being quietly destroyed by the people who were supposed to love him most, and who had been alone with that for longer than anyone should have to be. What I found was that paying attention, the same steady, careful attention I had given to patients for 3 decades, turned out to be its own kind of love. I had just never thought to give it to myself. Richard is sitting on the back porch right now as I finish telling you this. The painted bunting came back this spring, or one that looks just like it. He's been watching it for 20 minutes. In a little while I'll bring out coffee, and we'll sit together until the light changes, which is something we do most evenings now. And it will feel, the way it always does, completely ordinary and completely extraordinary at the same time. I am 64 years old. My son is healthy. The man I married for practical reasons has become someone I cannot imagine the mornings without. And the house that was too quiet when I first pulled into that driveway is filled now with the kind of sound that takes a long time to recognize, not noise exactly, but the particular hum of a life that is being lived honestly, by 2 people who chose each other more fully than either of them originally planned. If you are facing something impossible right now, something that has you sitting on the kitchen floor at 3 in the morning trying to understand a number, I want you to know something. The sacrifice you're making may take you somewhere you never expected. Pay attention when it does. Pay closer attention than you think you need to, and do not wait to ask for help. Go to the people who know the law, who know the medicine, who can stand in your corner when the people who should be standing there have chosen another direction entirely. The house is quiet again right now. But this time, the silence feels like something different. It feels like peace.